Sandra, an 8-year-old German Shepherd, adopted 2 Bobcat kittens when they were just 5 weeks old as part of a national program to reintroduce lynxes to a region where they had once been exterminated. Meanwhile, at the White Lion Wildlife Reserve, a lioness named Sirona gave birth to 3 cubs. But due to a traumatic past in the wild, she lacked maternal instincts and rejected them. Sadly, 2 cubs did not survive, and the last, severely malnourished, was saved just in time by veterinarians. In a desperate bid to give the little lion a chance, Sandra was brought in to nurse the cub alongside the Bobcat kittens. Remarkably, despite having previously disliked cats, Sandra immediately accepted both species. Sensing their urgent need, she not only nursed them, but also provided complete maternal care. But the story doesn't end there. 2 years later, something happened that would stun wildlife experts. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The morning light hung over the Cascade Mountain Wildlife Reserve in northern Washington state, where Dr. Margaret Sullivan had spent the last 23 years of her life rehabilitating orphaned and injured wildlife. At 62, with silver streaking through her auburn hair and hands weathered from decades of outdoor work, she thought she'd seen everything. But nothing could have prepared her for what would unfold over the next 2 years. A story that would challenge everything she knew about the bonds between species and the resilience of a mother's love. It began on a bitter March morning when wildlife officers brought in 2 Bobcat kittens, barely 5 weeks old, their eyes still adjusting to the world they'd barely known. Their mother had been struck by a logging truck on Highway 20, leaving these tiny creatures helpless in a den discovered by hikers. The kittens, a male and female, weighed less than 2 pounds each, their spotted coats still fuzzy with baby fur, their distinctive ear tufts just beginning to show. Margaret examined them carefully in the rehabilitation center's medical wing. The male, slightly larger, had a distinctive white patch on his chest. The female was more delicate, with striking amber eyes that seemed too large for her tiny face. Both were severely dehydrated and hypothermic. As Margaret worked to stabilize them, she couldn't help but think of Sandra, the facility's most unusual assistant. Sandra was an 8-year-old German Shepherd who had arrived at the reserve 6 years earlier as a trained search and rescue dog. Retired after an injury left her with a permanent limp in her hind leg. Her handler, Tom Bradley, had donated her to the reserve, knowing Margaret's reputation for giving working dogs purpose in their retirement. Sandra had proven invaluable, her maternal instincts helping raise everything from orphaned deer fawns to raccoon kits. She had recently weaned her own litter of puppies, adopted by families throughout the Pacific Northwest. "What do you think, old girl?" Margaret asked Sandra, who watched intently from her bed in the corner of the medical room. The shepherd's ears perked forward, her intelligent brown eyes studying the tiny bobcats. It was part of the reserve's reintroduction program, using domestic dogs to help teach orphaned wildcats essential survival skills while providing the maternal care they desperately needed. It was unconventional, but Margaret had seen it work before with smaller wild cats. Sandra approached slowly, her nose working, processing these new scents. The transformation was immediate and remarkable. Despite having shown a general dislike for the reserve's resident barn cats, Sandra's entire demeanor softened. She lowered herself gently beside the warming box containing the kittens and began to whine softly, a sound Margaret had only heard her make with her own puppies. Within hours, Sandra had accepted the Bobcat kittens completely. She cleaned them methodically, her large tongue gentle against their fragile bodies. When Margaret prepared formula, Sandra supervised every feeding, occasionally nudging Margaret's hand when she felt the angle of the bottle wasn't quite right. At night, Sandra curled her body around them, sharing her warmth, her steady heartbeat providing the comfort their wild mother could no longer give. The kittens thrived. Within 2 weeks, they were climbing over Sandra's patient form, pouncing on her tail, and engaging in the rough play that would one day make them successful hunters. Sandra tolerated it all with remarkable grace, occasionally disciplining them with a gentle paw when their needle-sharp claws dug too deep. It was during this peaceful period that everything changed. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in early April. Bob Harrison from the Harrison Exotic Wildlife Sanctuary, located 40 miles south, had an emergency. Bob's facility, though smaller than the state reserve, specialized in caring for exotic animals rescued from illegal ownership or failed roadside zoos. His voice crackled with urgency over the phone. "Margaret, I need your help. We've got a situation here I've never dealt with before." The story he told was heartbreaking. A lioness named Sirona had been rescued from an illegal breeding operation in Nevada 2 years prior. Traumatized by years of forced breeding and abuse, she had been slowly recovering at Bob's sanctuary. Against all odds, she had given birth to 3 cubs, likely conceived just before her rescue. But Sirona, her maternal instincts destroyed by her traumatic past, had rejected them completely. 2 didn't make it. Bob's voice was heavy with grief. But the 3rd, she's still fighting. She's maybe 2 weeks old, severely malnourished. My vet says she needs constant care, mothering that Sirona can't provide. I remembered what you told me about Sandra and those bobcats. Do you think? Margaret looked at Sandra, contentedly grooming the bobcat kittens who had grown considerably in the 3 weeks since their arrival. A lion cub. It was unprecedented, possibly dangerous, certainly controversial. But the alternative was letting an innocent creature die. "Bring her," Margaret said. The cub arrived that evening, and Margaret's heart nearly broke at the sight. She was impossibly small, her ribs visible through her tawny coat, her eyes barely open. The veterinarian who accompanied Bob estimated she weighed less than 3 pounds, dangerously underweight for a 2-week-old lion cub. Her breathing was labored, and she barely responded to stimulation. Margaret prepared a special area in the medical wing, separate from but visible to where Sandra tended the bobcat kittens. She needed to gauge Sandra's reaction before attempting any introduction. The German Shepherd watched with intense interest as Margaret and the vet worked to stabilize the cub, administering fluids and attempting to feed her with a specialized bottle. The cub refused the formula, turning her tiny head away weakly. Margaret tried everything. Different positions, temperatures, even different nipples on the bottles. Nothing worked. The cub was fading, and everyone in the room could feel it. It was Sandra who made the decision. She stood, leaving the bobcat kittens for the first time in hours, and walked deliberately to Margaret. She nudged Margaret's arm, then moved toward the dying cub. Her body language was clear. She wanted to help. "Sandra still has milk," Margaret said quietly to Bob and the vet. "She weaned her puppies only a month ago, and she's been producing a little for the bobcats, though they're mostly on formula now." It was a risk. Lions and domestic dogs were separated by millions of years of evolution. But as Margaret gently placed the tiny cub near Sandra, something miraculous happened. Sandra immediately began licking the cub, her ministrations more urgent than they'd been with the bobcats. She positioned herself carefully, and within moments the cub had latched on, nursing weakly but steadily. The room fell silent except for the tiny sounds of the cub nursing. Bob Harrison, a man who'd worked with exotic animals for 30 years, had tears streaming down his weathered face. The vet quietly documented everything, knowing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Over the following weeks, Sandra's routine became a careful ballet of maternal care. She would nurse and groom all three of her unlikely offspring, showing no favoritism despite their vastly different species. The Bobcat Kittens, now 7 weeks old, had accepted their strange new sibling with the adaptability of youth. They would curl up together, a tangle of spotted fur and tiny lion paws, with Sandra watching over them all. Margaret documented everything meticulously. The lion cub, whom the staff had begun calling Hope, gained weight rapidly. Her eyes brightened, and within 2 weeks, she was attempting to play with her bobcat siblings, though her coordination lagged behind theirs. Sandra seemed to understand the different needs of each species instinctively. She was gentler with Hope during play, but stricter about feeding times, ensuring the smaller bobcats got their share despite Hope's growing size. As spring turned to summer, Sandra began taking her unusual brood on supervised walks through the enclosed forest area of the reserve. It was crucial for the bobcats' development. They needed to experience the environment they would eventually call home. Hope would toddle along, trying to imitate the bobcat's stalking behavior, while Sandra kept vigilant watch. These walks became legendary among the reserve staff. Volunteers would gather at a respectful distance, watching in amazement as Sandra led her mixed family through the underbrush. She taught them all equally: how to be aware of their surroundings, how to move quietly, how to investigate new scents and sounds safely. The sight of the German Shepherd correcting a lion cub's stalking posture with a gentle paw became Margaret's favorite photograph, later featured in National Geographic's story about interspecies adoption. But as summer waned, reality began to intrude on this interspecies idyll. The bobcats, now 4 months old, were becoming increasingly independent. Their hunting instincts were strong, and they needed to begin the transition to life in the wild. Hope, at 3 months, was already nearly Sandra's size and growing rapidly. The safety concerns were becoming impossible to ignore. The decision to separate them was agonizing. Margaret knew it was necessary. The bobcats needed to develop their wild instincts without the influence of their domestic upbringing. And Hope needed to begin socializing with her own species at Bob's sanctuary, where another rescued lioness had recently arrived with cubs close to Hope's age. The separation happened gradually over 2 weeks in September. The bobcats were moved to a large pre-release enclosure deeper in the reserve, where human contact would be minimized. Hope was transported to Bob's sanctuary, where she would join other lions in a specially designed habitat. Sandra was present for each transition, seeming to understand in her remarkable way that this was necessary. The first night after all three were gone, Sandra refused to eat. She lay in the spot where she had nursed them, whimpering softly. Margaret stayed with her, stroking her graying muzzle, both of them grieving the end of something extraordinary. For weeks, Sandra would patrol the areas where she had walked with her adopted family, searching for scents that grew fainter each day. Winter came harsh and early that year. The bobcats, now in a remote part of the reserve, were thriving according to the monitoring cameras. They hunted successfully, had established territory, and showed all the signs of successful rehabilitation. Hope, Margaret learned through regular updates from Bob, had integrated beautifully with the other lions and was growing into a magnificent young lioness. Sandra returned to her work at the reserve, helping raise other orphaned animals, but something in her had changed. She was quieter, more thoughtful, often staring toward the forest where she'd last walked with her unusual family. 2 years passed. It was another March morning, almost exactly 2 years since the bobcats had first arrived, when Margaret heard Sandra barking. Not her usual alert bark, but something different, almost joyful. Margaret rushed outside to find Sandra at the fence line that bordered the wild portion of the reserve. There, on the other side of the fence, sat a fully grown bobcat with a distinctive white patch on his chest. The male Kit, now a magnificent adult weighing perhaps 30 pounds, sat calmly, his golden eyes fixed on Sandra. They regarded each other for a long moment, and then the bobcat did something extraordinary. He chirped, a soft, trilling sound bobcats make to communicate with their young, but directed at Sandra. Sandra's tail wagged so hard her entire body shook. She play-bowed, just as she had when he was a kitten, and the bobcat responded by rubbing against the fence where Sandra pressed her nose. They stayed that way for several minutes before the bobcat melted back into the forest, but not before looking back once, as if to say goodbye properly this time. Word of the encounter spread, and Bob Harrison called the next day. "You need to come see this," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Margaret and Sandra made the drive to Bob's sanctuary. As they approached Hope's enclosure, the now fully grown lioness, 280 pounds of muscle and grace, rushed to the fence. The sound she made was not a roar, but a series of soft chuffs, the greeting lions reserved for family. Sandra, showing no fear, pressed against the fence, her tail wagging, small whines escaping her throat. Hope lay down against the fence as close to Sandra as she could get and began grooming her own paw, a behavior Sandra had taught her as a cub. They stayed that way for an hour, the lioness and the dog, separated by steel but connected by something stronger. When it was time to leave, Hope followed along the fence line as far as she could, watching until Sandra's vehicle disappeared from view. The reunion made national news. Wildlife biologists came to study the phenomenon, trying to understand how these bonds had persisted despite 2 years of separation and the vast species divide. But Margaret knew the answer was simpler than any scientific explanation. Love transcends biology. Sandra lived another 4 years, continuing her work at the reserve until the very end. The bobcats were occasionally spotted on the reserve's cameras, always near the areas where Sandra had walked them. Hope grew into one of the sanctuary's most gentle residents, often chosen to help acclimate new rescues, her unusual upbringing having given her a remarkable capacity for empathy. When Sandra passed peacefully in her sleep at 14, Margaret made sure both Bob's sanctuary and the reserve staff knew. That night, the motion cameras in the bobcat territory captured something remarkable. Both bobcats, now with families of their own, sitting at the fence line where the male had visited Sandra, their faces turned toward the moon, calling in their wild voices. At Bob's sanctuary, Hope spent the entire night pacing and vocalizing, somehow knowing that the dog who had saved her life, who had been her mother in every way that mattered, was gone. Margaret had Sandra cremated, and with special permission, scattered some of her ashes in the forest where she had walked her unusual babies, and sent some to Bob to scatter in Hope's enclosure. As she watched the ashes drift on the wind, Margaret thought about the countless lives Sandra had touched, but none more profoundly than 3 wild babies who had needed a mother and found one in the most unlikely place. The reserve created a memorial garden in Sandra's honor, with a bronze statue depicting her with the 2 bobcat kittens and the lion cub. The inscription reads, "Love knows no boundaries, no species, no limits. In memory of Sandra, who taught us that a mother's heart is large enough for all Earth's creatures." Visitors often ask Margaret if the story is true, if one dog really raised such different wild animals, and if they really remembered her years later. She always smiles and points to the forest, where occasionally, if you're very lucky and very quiet, you might spot a bobcat with a white patch on his chest, sitting near the memorial garden, keeping watch over the memory of the dog who raised him. Love, Margaret always says, is the most powerful force in nature. It bridges every divide, heals every wound, and creates families in the most unexpected ways. Sandra proved that every single day, and her legacy lives on in every creature she touched. And in the sanctuary 40 miles south, a magnificent lioness still chuffs softly whenever she sees a German shepherd, remembering the one who gave her life when her own mother couldn't, who taught her that family isn't defined by species, but by the fierce, protective, all-encompassing love that knows no boundaries.